The roar of the Allison V-1710 engine filled the cramped cockpit as Lieutenant James Brennan scanned the horizon over the North African desert. It was November 1942, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the sand dunes below, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful in any other circumstance. His P-40 Warhawk, painted with the distinctive shark mouth that had become synonymous with Allied fighter squadrons, cut through the thin air at 12,000 feet. The sky was a brilliant blue, deceptively peaceful, hiding the violence that was about to unfold. The cockpit smelled of oil, leather, and the faint metallic tang of high-altitude air. Brennan's hands rested lightly on the control stick and throttle, movements born from hundreds of hours in the air, making every adjustment automatic, instinctive. The instrument panel before him was a constellation of dials and gauges, each one telling a story about the aircraft's health and status: airspeed, altitude, fuel, oil pressure, coolant temperature. He scanned them constantly, the way a doctor might check a patient's vital signs. Brennan had left the airfield near El Alamein just after dawn, part of a routine patrol mission along the coast. The British Eighth Army was pushing Rommel's Afrika Korps westward, and the skies had become a deadly chessboard where every move could mean life or death. Intelligence had reported increased Luftwaffe activity in the sector. German fighters and bombers attempting to disrupt Allied supply lines and provide air cover for the retreating Axis ground forces. Every mission carried risk, but this morning had seemed routine, almost mundane. Just another patrol, just another few hours in the air. At 23 years old, Brennan had already logged 47 combat missions, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to face. He was from Grand Rapids, Michigan, the son of a factory foreman and a school teacher. Before the war, he had worked as a mechanic, spent his evenings taking flying lessons at a small airfield outside town. When Pearl Harbor happened, he had enlisted within a week, driven by a sense that the world needed defenders, that his comfortable American life was only possible because men were willing to fight for it. The radio crackled in his headset, static, then silence. He adjusted the dial, but the interference persisted. Something felt wrong. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. That sixth sense that combat pilots developed when they had survived long enough. He pushed the throttle forward slightly, gaining another 500 feet of altitude, his eyes constantly moving, searching the brilliant expanse of sky. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am telling it, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories from history to life. Then he saw them. First, just black dots on the horizon to the northeast, barely visible against the glare of the morning sun. Brennan's stomach tightened. In air combat, spotting the enemy first often meant the difference between life and death. He blinked hard, making sure it was not just dust on his goggles or a trick of the light. No, they were real. Aircraft. Multiple aircraft. But as they grew closer, as the dots resolved into recognizable shapes with wings and fuselages, Brennan's blood ran cold. It was not a squadron. It was not even a group. The sky ahead of him was filling with enemy aircraft, their formations spreading across his field of vision like a dark storm cloud rolling in from the sea. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force, their angular silhouettes unmistakable even at this distance. The sleek, predatory shapes that had terrorized the skies over Europe were now arrayed before him in numbers he had never encountered. And behind them, more planes. Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, the feared dive bombers, with their distinctive inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear, and their escorts. Brennan's gloved hand tightened on the control stick until the leather creaked. He counted quickly, his eyes darting from one formation to another, his mind automatically cataloguing what he was seeing. 20 fighters in the first group, flying in neat finger-four formations. 30 in the second wave, slightly higher, positioned to provide top cover. 40. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat seeming to echo in the confined space of the cockpit. 50 German aircraft, 60. The formations kept coming, layer upon layer of enemy fighters stretching across miles of sky. 64. 64 enemy aircraft, and he was alone. His squadron had been scattered during the patrol, each pilot covering a different sector, a standard practice designed to maximize coverage, but one that left each man vulnerable if something went wrong. He was supposed to be the early warning, the eyes that would spot any incoming threat and radio back to base. But his radio was dead, filled with nothing but static and interference. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the canopy of his P-40, and sweat began to trickle down his temples, soaking into the worn leather of his flying helmet. The temperature in the cockpit was already approaching uncomfortable levels, and his breathing came faster now, shallow and quick. His mind raced through the tactical situation with the practiced efficiency of a trained fighter pilot. 64 enemy aircraft, 1 P-40, no radio contact, no support. The nearest friendly airfield was 15 minutes away at cruise speed, probably 12 if he pushed it. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to bank away, to dive for the deck and run, to push the throttle to the firewall and race back to friendly territory. The P-40 was a good aircraft, rugged and reliable, but it was not built for dogfighting at altitude against the nimble Bf-109s, and certainly not against 64 of them. But as he watched the enemy formation draw closer, something else crystallized in his mind with sudden, terrible clarity. Below that formation, perhaps 15 miles behind the enemy fighters, he could make out the distinctive shapes of British Hurricane bombers, part of a major strike package heading toward Axis supply lines. The Hurricanes were flying low, probably no more than 8,000 feet, loaded with bombs and maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection. They had no idea what was coming. The Hurricanes would be sitting ducks, slow and vulnerable, loaded with bombs, and flying in tight formation that made them easy targets. Each bomber carried a crew of 5 men. Brennan counted at least 12 Hurricanes in the formation he could see. 60 men. 60 men who would die if those German fighters reached them unannounced and unready. If those 64 German fighters reached them, it would be a massacre. Dozens of men would die, burned alive in their aircraft or shot to pieces before they could even release their payload. The choice before him was stark, binary, brutal in its simplicity. Turn away, race back to base, live to fight another day, or attack, disrupt the German formation, buy time for the Hurricanes to scatter or at least prepare for what was coming. The first option was rational, logical, what any sane pilot would do when faced with such overwhelming odds. The second option was suicide. Pure mathematics said he had perhaps a 5% chance of surviving an engagement with that many enemy fighters. Probably less. Brennan's squadron commander, Major Thomas Caldwell, had told him something 3 months earlier after a particularly brutal mission where they had lost 2 pilots. The fight had been over Tobruk, protecting supply ships in the harbor from German dive bombers. They had been outnumbered 3-1, and though they had driven off the bombers, the cost had been high. Lieutenant Marcus Phillips had been shot down over the water, his P-40 cartwheeling into the Mediterranean in a spray of white foam and twisted metal. No parachute, no chance. 22 years old from Dallas, always talking about the ranch his family owned, the horses he wanted to breed after the war. Gone in an instant. Lieutenant Robert Reeves had made it back to the airfield, his P-40 so shot up that it pancaked on landing, cartwheeling across the desert sand. Reeves had been pulled from the wreckage alive but unconscious, his body broken. He died 2 hours later in the field hospital, never regaining consciousness, never knowing whether the mission had been a success. 25 years old, from Boston, engaged to a girl named Sarah, who wrote him letters every week, letters he kept tied with a ribbon in his footlocker, letters that would now be returned to her unopened, along with the rest of his effects, and a telegram expressing regret and gratitude for his service. That evening, after the burials, after the paperwork and the debriefings, Brennan and Caldwell had been sitting in the officer's tent, the Mediterranean breeze carrying the smell of aviation fuel and sand through the open flaps. The tent was supposed to be a place to relax, to decompress after missions, but it never really felt that way. The smell of death followed you everywhere in war, an invisible presence that colored every moment. Caldwell, a veteran of the Battle of Britain who had shot down 11 German aircraft over England before being sent to North Africa, had poured 2 glasses of scotch from his personal bottle, a luxury he guarded jealously. The Major was 31 years old, but looked older, his face weathered by sun and stress, deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many lost friends, too many impossible missions. He'd handed Brennan one of the glasses without speaking, and they had sat in silence for a long time, just drinking and listening to the sound of the wind. When Caldwell finally spoke, his voice was rough from too many cigarettes and too much combat. But the words were clear and deliberate, the words of a man who had thought deeply about what he was going to say. "One pilot can change everything," Caldwell had said, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "I've seen it happen, Jim. More than once. One man in the right place, making the right choice, even if it seems impossible, even if every logical calculation says it can't work. That's what separates us from them. We don't fight for ideology or conquest or racial superiority. We fight because someone has to stand up, even when the odds say we should run. Especially then. That's when it matters most." Brennan had asked him what he meant, and Caldwell had smiled, a sad, tired smile that held years of experience and loss. During the Battle of Britain, Caldwell had said, "There was a day when I was on patrol over Kent, just me and my wingman. We spotted a formation of German bombers, must have been 40 or 50 of them, heading for London. We were supposed to report it, wait for reinforcements, engage only when we had proper numbers. That's what the book says. That's what a smart pilot does. But my wingman, a kid named Thompson from Liverpool, he looked at those bombers, and then he looked at me. And I could see in his eyes that he was thinking the same thing I was thinking. Those bombers were going to drop their loads on London, on civilians, on homes and schools and hospitals, and if we waited for reinforcements, they would reach the city and kill God knows how many people before anyone could stop them. So what did you do, sir?" Brennan had asked, already knowing the answer. "We attacked," Caldwell had said simply, 2 fighters against 50 bombers and their escorts. We tore into that formation like wolves, hitting them from every angle, firing at anything that moved. We shot down 4 bombers between us, damaged maybe a dozen more. But more importantly, we broke up their formation. The bomber pilots panicked, started taking evasive action, dumping their loads early or turning back. By the time the rest of our squadron arrived, the threat was scattered and manageable. Thompson did not make it, shot down by a Bf-110. I saw his plane go in, watched him try to bail out, but the canopy was jammed. He rode it all the way down into a field outside Canterbury. They gave him a posthumous, Distinguished Flying Cross. His mother came to the ceremony. Nice woman. Cried the whole time. Told me her son had always wanted to be a pilot, ever since he was a boy watching biplanes at air shows. Caldwell had drained his glass then, poured another. The point, Jim, is that Thompson made a choice. He could have followed the book, played it safe, lived to fight another day, but he looked at what needed to be done, and he did it, knowing the cost. That's courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And his sacrifice mattered. The bomber raid was disrupted. Fewer people died in London that day. One pilot, one choice, one moment. It changed everything for someone. Brennan remembered those words now, as he stared at the approaching enemy formation. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. His ammunition counters showed full loads in all 6 50-caliber machine guns. He was one man in one aircraft against 64, but he had something those German pilots did not expect: surprise. And perhaps, if he played it right, just enough time to give the Hurricane Squadron a chance to scatter or prepare for the assault. His decision crystallized in that moment, sharp and clear as broken glass. He was not going to run. He was going to attack. Brennan pushed the throttle forward to maximum power, feeling the P-40 surge beneath him. The engine roared, a defiant challenge thrown at the sky. He armed his guns, the electrical switches clicking under his gloved fingers. His hands were steady now, the initial fear transforming into something else: focus, determination, the acceptance that he might not make it back, but that his death might buy precious minutes for those bombers and their crews. He angled his approach carefully, using the sun at his back to hide his single aircraft for as long as possible. The P-40 was heavy, built like a tank, and it excelled in one thing: diving. Brennan climbed higher, gaining another 2,000 feet, his eyes never leaving the enemy formation. They were flying in a loose combat spread, confident, probably expecting no resistance this far from Allied positions. The lead elements were already beginning to descend toward where the Hurricane bombers would be in less than 10 minutes. At 14,000 feet, Brennan rolled his P-40 inverted and pulled, the horizon spinning as he entered a steep diving attack. The world turned upside down, sky and desert trading places in a dizzying rush that would have disoriented an inexperienced pilot, but felt natural to Brennan after months of combat. The wind screamed past the canopy, a banshee wail that grew louder as his speed increased. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, the needle sweeping across the dial like a clock hand gone mad. 200 knots, 250, 300. The P-40 shook with the speed, every rivet and panel vibrating, the control stick humming in his hands with the aerodynamic forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. But the old bird held together. It always did. The P-40 was built like a tank, overbuilt if anything, with a ruggedness that had saved countless pilots' lives. Brennan's vision narrowed as the G-forces from the dive pushed blood toward his feet. He tensed his leg muscles, grunting against the pressure, fighting to keep consciousness as the world narrowed to a tunnel focused on his target. His left hand adjusted the throttle and mixture controls with practiced precision, maximizing power while keeping the engine from over-revving. The Allison V-1710 roared its defiance, the sound filling the cockpit, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to say, keep going, we can do this." He picked his target carefully, methodically, the way Caldwell had taught him. Don't just shoot at the nearest enemy. Pick the target that will cause the most disruption. The rearmost element of Bf-109s, a flight of 4 aircraft flying in the Finger 4 formation that the Germans had pioneered and that had proven so effective in combat. The trailing Messerschmitt was painted in the standard Luftwaffe desert scheme, tan and brown camouflage with black crosses on the wings and fuselage. Brennan could not see the pilot, but he knew there was a man in that cockpit, probably young like himself, probably scared despite his training, probably thinking about home and family and whether he would survive another day of this war. The German pilots had no idea he was there, diving out of the sun like a hawk falling on unsuspecting prey, the oldest tactical trick in aviation, but still effective when executed with precision and timing. Brennan centered the trailing Messerschmitt in his gun sight, the illuminated reticle placing a bright orange dot on the enemy's engine cowling. He led the target slightly to account for deflection, for the relative motion between his diving P-40 and the level-flying Bf-109. His instructors at flight school had drilled this into him endlessly. Lead the target, account for bullet drop and travel time. Don't just aim where the enemy is, aim where he's going to be. His thumb hovered over the firing button on the control stick, and he could feel his heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake his entire body. 400 yards, still too far. The 50 caliber machine guns were effective out to 1,000 yards, but scoring hits at that distance required luck more than skill. 300 yards, getting close. The Bf-109 grew larger in his gun sight, the details of its construction becoming visible. He could see the individual panel lines, the exhaust stacks trailing thin streams of hot gas, the subtle movements of the control surfaces as the German pilot made minor corrections to stay in formation. 250 yards. Almost there, Brennan held his fire, his discipline overriding the adrenaline-fueled urge to start shooting. Wait for the perfect moment. At 200 yards, close enough that he could not possibly miss, barring a mechanical failure or a sudden evasive maneuver by his target, he pressed the button. The P-40 shuddered as all 6 50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously, the recoil noticeable even in a 4-ton aircraft traveling at over 300 knots. A devastating volume of rounds tore through the air. Over 3,000 rounds per minute combined from all 6 guns, creating a cone of destruction that few aircraft could survive. Tracer rounds drew bright lines across the sky, 1 in every 5 bullets loaded with phosphorus that burned white hot, allowing the pilot to see where his fire was going and adjust his aim. The lines converged on the target like searchlight beams finding their focal point. The rearmost Bf-109 seemed to stagger in mid-air as the rounds struck home, the aircraft shuddering under the impact of dozens of half-inch projectiles traveling at over 2,000 feet per second. Each bullet carried enough kinetic energy to punch through aluminum and steel, to destroy engines and tear apart control surfaces. The stream of fire stitched across the fuselage and wing root, the most vulnerable part of any aircraft, where the wing joined the fuselage and where fuel tanks and critical control runs were located. Pieces of metal flew off, glittering in the sunlight like confetti at a deadly celebration. The Messerschmitt's engine cowling disintegrated, revealing the complex machinery within. Black smoke poured from the engine, thick and oily, and Brennan saw bright orange flames licking back from the firewall. The German fighter rolled sharply to the left, trailing fire and smoke as it fell away from the formation, its pilot either dead or desperately trying to gain control of the dying aircraft long enough to bail out. Brennan did not watch it fall. He was already pulling hard on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as he pulled out of the dive and immediately reversed, pulling up into a steep climbing turn to the right. His vision grayed at the edges, the blood draining from his head, but he kept the pressure on, his body tensed against the forces, trying to render him unconscious. The hornet's nest had been kicked. The entire German formation seemed to explode into action. Fighters peeled off in every direction, pilots calling out warnings in German over their radios. Brennan could not understand the words, but he could imagine the confusion and surprise. Who was attacking them? How many Allied fighters were there? 2 Bf-109s came after him immediately, their pilots reacting with the skill and aggression that had made the Luftwaffe feared across Europe and North Africa. They turned inside his climb, cutting him off, forcing him to roll away and dive again. Brennan kicked the rudder hard, skidding the P-40 sideways, throwing off their aim. Tracers zipped past his canopy, bright streaks of death that missed by feet. He dove again, this time heading straight into the main body of the formation. It was madness, suicidal, but it was also the last thing they would expect. The German fighters scattered as the lone P-40 tore through their midst, Brennan firing short bursts at targets of opportunity, not taking time to aim carefully, just spraying rounds into the formation. He saw strikes on at least 2 more aircraft, one Bf-109 streaming coolant, another breaking away with damage to its tail section. But more importantly, the entire formation had broken up. The neat combat spreads and disciplined flights had dissolved into chaos. as pilots tried to track the single audacious Allied fighter that had dared to attack them. They were no longer heading toward the Hurricane bombers. They were turning, engaging, trying to bring their superior numbers to bear on this one target. Brennan's radio suddenly burst to life, the interference clearing for a moment. He heard British voices, urgent and confused. "Unidentified fighter engaging enemy formation. Break off! You're alone out there. Break off and return to base." But Brennan could not respond. His transmitter was still dead, only the receiver working. He could hear them, but they could not hear him. He was on his own, and he had to keep the pressure on, keep the Germans focused on him for as long as possible. A Messerschmitt dropped onto his tail. The pilot good, very good, staying with him through a hard break to the left. Cannon rounds exploded in the air around Brennan's P-40, the Germans' MG-151 cannons, far more destructive than machine guns. One round clipped his left wing, tearing a jagged hole through the metal. Another struck somewhere behind him, and he felt the impact transmitted through the airframe. Brennan threw the P-40 into a violent scissors maneuver, reversing direction twice in quick succession, the aircraft groaning under the stress. The German pilot anticipated the first reverse, but was caught off guard by the second. For a split second, the Bf-109 flew across Brennan's nose, and he fired. The burst was short, no more than 2 seconds, but it was enough. Rounds hammered into the Messerschmitt's cockpit and engine, and the German fighter rolled away, trailing smoke and debris. But there were too many. Everywhere Brennan looked, there were enemy aircraft. The sky was full of them, black crosses on grey-green camouflage, all trying to kill him. His P-40 was taking hits now, multiple impacts from machine gun fire. The left aileron was damaged, making the aircraft sluggish in turns to that side. Oil temperature was climbing, the gauge needle creeping into the yellow zone. He dove again, heading for the deck, hoping to use the P-40's diving speed to create separation. The desert rushed up to meet him, brown and tan and endless. At 5,000 feet he leveled off, the airspeed still showing over 300 knots. Behind him, the German fighters followed, but they were more cautious now, respecting the desperate ferocity of this lone pilot who refused to run. Brennan glanced at his fuel gauge, half a tank. He had been in combat for less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. His shoulders ached from the constant maneuvering, the G-forces and tension. His throat was dry, tasting of metal and fear. But he was still alive, and more importantly, he had bought time. The Hurricane bombers had to have been warned by now, had to have scattered or changed course. The radio crackled again. This time, a different voice cut through the static, and Brennan's heart leaped with hope and relief. American, familiar. "Lone P-40, this is Saber Leader. We have you on visual. Hold on, we're coming." Brennan looked up, his eyes searching the sky even as he threw the P-40 into another desperate maneuver to avoid a Bf-109 that was lining up for a shot. And there they were, 6 P-40s, diving out of the northwest like avenging angels, their shark mouths painted with fresh kills from previous missions, guns already blazing as they tore into the German formation. Caldwell was leading them, the Major's aircraft easily identified by the row of kill markings painted below the canopy. 13 small swastikas, each one representing a confirmed German aircraft destroyed. The Major had been monitoring the radio frequencies, heard the increased German radio chatter, and deduced that something major was happening. He had rallied the scattered elements of the squadron and raced toward the sound of the guns. The odds had suddenly changed. 7 against 64 was still terrible, still heavily weighted against the Allies. But it was no longer hopeless. The tide had not turned, but at least now there was a tide to turn. The math had gone from impossible to merely extremely difficult. And for fighter pilots who lived on the edge of death every day, that difference was everything. The Germans, already scattered and disorganized by Brennan's initial attack and his continued harassment, now found themselves fighting on 2 fronts, caught between the original attacker who refused to break off and die like a sensible man would, and this new threat coming in from an unexpected angle. The disciplined German formation, which had been the hallmark of Luftwaffe tactics since the Spanish Civil War, completely fell apart. Individual dogfights erupted across miles of desert sky, aircraft twisting and diving and climbing, firing and evading in the deadly three-dimensional dance of aerial combat that had claimed so many lives since the war began. Brennan found himself flying alongside another P-40, the pilot giving him a quick thumbs-up through the canopy before breaking away to engage a Bf-109 that was trying to get on Brennan's tail. It was Lieutenant Danny Foster, his wingman on dozens of missions, a farm kid from Iowa who had never even seen the ocean before joining the Army Air Corps. Foster was 21 years old, blonde and perpetually sunburned, always joking about how the North African sun was worse than any Iowa summer he had ever experienced. But in the air, Foster was all business, a natural pilot with reflexes that bordered on precognitive. He could sense where an enemy was going to be before they got there, a gift that had kept him alive through months of combat. Foster's P-40 pulled hard to the right, cutting inside the Bf-109's turn, a maneuver that should have been impossible given the Messerschmitt's superior turning performance at altitude. But Foster knew his aircraft intimately, knew exactly how far he could push it, knew that the P-40 had one advantage. It was heavy and strong, and in the vertical plane, in dives and climbs, it could match or exceed almost any fighter in the world. He used that advantage now, pulling up sharply after the turn, climbing at an angle that forced the German pilot to choose between following and losing energy or breaking off and finding another target. The German chose to follow, a fatal mistake. Foster's P-40 fired a long burst as it climbed, the rounds arcing up and catching the Messerschmitt as it tried to follow the same maneuver. The burst was perfectly placed, raking across the Bf-109's belly and engine from nose to tail. The aircraft staggered, hit hard, smoke pouring from multiple impact points. Brennan saw the German pilot trying to recover, saw the canopy fly off as the pilot prepared to bail out. The figure tumbled from the cockpit, falling for a few seconds before the white parachute blossomed above him. The German would survive the day, would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp, but he was out of the fight. Foster's voice came over the radio, calm and professional, despite having just killed a man. "Scratch one. Jim, you've got 2 on your 6. Break left now." Brennan did not question it. Foster's situational awareness was legendary in the squadron. If he said break left, you broke left. Brennan threw the stick hard over, the P-40 responding with a violence that made his vision grey at the edges. 2 Bf-109s flashed through the space where he had been a second earlier, their guns firing, tracers cutting through empty air. They overshot, their superior speed at altitude becoming a liability as they struggled to slow down and turn back toward their target. But the Germans were not finished. They still had overwhelming numbers, and they began to regroup, forming smaller elements that worked together to isolate individual Allied fighters. Brennan saw one P-40 go down, trailing fire and smoke, the pilot bailing out at the last second, his parachute blossoming white against the brown desert. He did not see if the pilot made it to the ground safely. The fight raged on. Brennan's P-40 was a wreck. The left wing had multiple holes, the oil temperature was in the red, and the engine was making an unhealthy rattling sound. His ammunition was almost exhausted, the counters showing less than 50 rounds per gun. But he kept fighting, kept turning, kept firing short bursts at any German fighter that presented itself as a target. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The German formation broke off, turning northeast, heading back toward their own lines. They had lost 11 aircraft, either shot down or damaged so badly they would never make it home. The P-40 squadron had lost 2, with 3 more damaged. Brennan's aircraft was barely flyable, but he was alive. The formation regrouped slowly, the remaining P-40s forming up on Caldwell's lead. The Major's voice came over the radio, calm and steady, despite what they had just been through. All aircraft, set course for home. Nice work, boys. Brennan, that was either the bravest or the dumbest thing I've ever seen. We'll discuss which when we're on the ground. Brennan tried to respond, but his transmitter was still dead. He simply waggled his wings in acknowledgement, the damaged control surfaces making the motion jerky and awkward. The flight back to El Alamein took 30 minutes, each minute an eternity, as Brennan nursed his crippled P-40 across the desert. The engine temperature kept climbing, and twice he thought it was going to seize completely, but the tough old Allison kept running, kept dragging him towards safety. The airfield appeared on the horizon, a collection of tents and dispersed aircraft shimmering in the heat haze, with the single packed dirt runway running east to west, marked with white stones that had been painted and arranged by the ground crews. Home, safety. The word felt foreign after what he had just been through. Brennan was the last to land, his approach shaky, the damaged aileron making it difficult to keep the wings level. Every control input felt wrong, delayed, as if the aircraft was fighting him. The P-40 wanted to roll to the left, the damaged wing losing lift, and Brennan had to use constant right aileron pressure just to keep the wings approximately level. He lined up on final approach, the runway stretching before him like a ribbon of packed dirt and hope. His airspeed was higher than normal, because he did not trust the damaged aircraft to maintain control at slower speeds. The engine was running rough now, the temperature gauge buried in the red zone, the oil pressure dropping steadily. Black smoke trailed behind him, visible to everyone on the ground, a sign that things were very wrong with the aircraft that had somehow made it home. Brennan crossed the runway threshold and pulled back on the stick, flaring for landing. The P-40 responded sluggishly, dropping faster than he wanted. He touched down hard, much harder than any landing he had made in training or even in previous combat operations. The main wheels hit first with a jarring impact that rattled his teeth. Then the aircraft bounced, lifting back into the air for a moment before settling back down with another bone-jarring thud. The tail wheel slammed down, and Brennan felt something in the tail structure give way with an audible crack that he heard even over the sound of the engine. The P-40 swerved to the left, the damaged landing gear trying to collapse, but somehow held. He used brake and rudder to keep it on the runway, fighting the aircraft every inch of the way, until it finally rolled to a stop near the dispersal area, engine coughing and dying with a final shudder. Brennan sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands still on the controls, unable to quite believe he was on the ground and alive. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had kept him sharp and focused during the fight draining away and leaving him hollow and exhausted. He shut down what was left of the systems, flipping switches with mechanical precision, the ritual of shutdown familiar and comforting. Mixture to idle cutoff, magnetos off, master electrical off, fuel selector off. Each action was a small step back toward normalcy, toward a world where he was not being shot at by 64 enemy aircraft. Ground crew swarmed his aircraft immediately, their faces showing shock and concern as they saw the extent of the damage. Men in oil-stained coveralls rushed forward with fire extinguishers, worried about fuel leaks or electrical fires. Others just stood and stared, counting the bullet holes, shaking their heads in disbelief. There were mechanics and armorers and crew chiefs, all of them professionals who had seen damaged aircraft before, but this was something different. This was an aircraft that by all rights should not have made it back. Crew Chief Morrison, a grizzled sergeant who had been maintaining aircraft since before most of his mechanics were born, walked slowly around the P-40, his weathered face grim. Morrison was 45 years old, a career non-com who had served in France during the First World War as a mechanic with the Lafayette Escadrille. He had maintained SPAD fighters and Nieuport scouts, kept those fragile wood and canvas aircraft flying in impossible conditions. He thought he had seen everything that war could do to an airplane, but this made him shake his head in wonder. There were over 60 bullet holes in the airframe, and those were just the ones he could see from a walk-around inspection. The left wing was shredded, the aluminum skin torn and punctured, the internal structure visible through the gaps. Several ribs were cracked or broken, barely holding the wing together. The aileron on that side was more whole than metal, hanging by its hinges, a miracle it had provided any control authority at all. The engine was leaking oil and coolant from multiple punctures, the precious fluids dripping onto the desert sand and leaving dark stains. The tail structure had a crack running halfway across the vertical stabilizer, the metal fatigued from the stress of combat maneuvering and bullet impacts. The canopy had 3 spiderweb cracks where bullets had struck but not penetrated, saved only by the angle of impact and sheer luck. Morrison walked a complete circle around the aircraft, then stood with his hands on his hips, looking up at Brennan, who was still in the cockpit trying to summon the energy to climb out. The sergeant's voice carried clearly in the afternoon air, rough with emotion and wonder. "Lieutenant, I don't know how you got this bird back. I truly don't. By all rights, by every law of mechanics and physics and common sense, you should be decorating the desert right now. This aircraft should not fly. Hell, it should barely hold together on the ground. But here you are. I've been working on aircraft for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Brennan climbed out of the cockpit, his legs shaky, his flight suit soaked with sweat that had already started to evaporate in the dry desert air, leaving salt stains on the khaki fabric. He pulled off his helmet and goggles, running a hand through his matted hair, feeling how soaked it was. His face was marked with the imprint of the oxygen mask and goggles, red lines across his cheeks and forehead. His hands were still trembling slightly, the aftermath of adrenaline and stress, and the realization of how close he had come to dying. Major Caldwell was waiting for him, standing with the rest of the squadron pilots who had already landed and secured their aircraft. The Major's flight suit was dark with sweat, and his face showed the same exhaustion that Brennan felt. Behind Caldwell stood Foster, looking surprisingly fresh despite the combat, his Iowa farm boy grin firmly in place. There was Lieutenant Wilson from Texas, Lieutenant Harrison from California, Lieutenant Cooper from Massachusetts, the surviving members of the squadron, all of them gathered to see the man who had taken on 64 German fighters by himself. The pilots gathered around, forming a loose semicircle, and for a moment, no one spoke. They just looked at him, and he looked back, all of them understanding what did not need to be said. They understood the fear, the split-second decisions, the way time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously during combat. They understood the bond that formed between men who depended on each other for survival, who flew into danger together and somehow came back alive. Words were inadequate for what they had just experienced, for what Brennan had done, for the miracle that they were all standing there in the afternoon sun, instead of being scattered across miles of North African desert. Caldwell finally broke the silence. He stepped forward and put a hand on Brennan's shoulder. The Hurricane Squadron made it through, took out 3 German supply convoys and made it back with minimal losses. They radioed in, said they saw the whole thing on their scopes, 60-plus bandits turning to engage a single contact. They figured whoever it was had bought them enough time to complete the mission and get clear. That was you, wasn't it? You went in alone. Brennan nodded, suddenly exhausted. Yes, sir. Radio was out. Couldn't warn anyone. Figured if I hit them hard enough, fast enough, I could buy some time. Guess it worked. Caldwell's grip on his shoulder tightened. You went after 64 German fighters by yourself. Do you understand how insane that sounds? How statistically impossible it was that you'd survive? I know, sir. But I couldn't let them reach the Hurricanes. Those crews, They'd have been slaughtered. Someone had to do something. Foster stepped forward, grinning despite the tension. Someone had to do something, he says, like it was just another day at the office. And Jim, you're either going to get the Distinguished Service Cross or a court-martial for reckless endangerment. Maybe both. The other pilots laughed, the tension breaking. They crowded around Brennan, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand, reliving the fight in quick, excited bursts of conversation. But Brennan barely heard them. He was looking at his P-40, at the tattered American flag painted on the fuselage, at the shark mouth that had seen him through so many missions. The old bird had brought him home one more time. That evening, Brennan sat alone on a crate outside his tent, watching the sun set over the desert. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red, beautiful and peaceful, so different from the violence of the morning. He thought about the German pilots he had shot down, wondered if they had families waiting for them, wondered if they had made it out of their aircraft before they hit the ground. War was like that. You did not have time to think about it in the moment, but afterward, in the quiet hours, the reality settled in. Caldwell found him there, sitting in the fading light. The major sat down beside him, offering a cigarette. Brennan took it, though he rarely smoked. They sat in silence for a while, just smoking and watching the sun disappear below the horizon. "You know," Caldwell said eventually, "I've been flying fighters for 4 years now. Battle of Britain, Malta, now this. I've seen a lot of brave men do a lot of brave things. But what you did today, Jim, that was something different. Most men would have run. Hell, most men should have run. You had every reason to, but you didn't. You went in knowing you probably wouldn't come back. Why?" Brennan thought about it for a long moment, trying to put into words something he did not fully understand himself. "Because they needed time, sir. The hurricanes. They needed someone to give them a chance. And I was there. It was just that simple. I was there, and I could do something, so I did." Caldwell nodded slowly. "That's the difference between a good pilot and a great one. A good pilot makes the smart choice, plays the odds, lives to fight another day. A great pilot looks at the impossible and finds a way. You found a way today. Those hurricane crews, they're alive because you made a choice that defied every rule in the book." They sat in silence again, the desert air cooling rapidly as night approached. Stars began to appear, brilliant and countless, the same stars that had watched over countless battles, countless young men fighting and dying far from home. "What happens now?" Brennan asked. Caldwell smiled slightly. "Now, you write your report. Try to make it sound less insane than it actually was. And then you get back in the cockpit and do it all over again tomorrow. Because that's what we do, that's the job. But there's going to be paperwork, isn't there?" "Oh, yes. Lots of paperwork. And probably a medal ceremony at some point, though I doubt you care much about that. The important thing is, you're alive, your squadron came home, and those hurricane crews got to complete their mission. In this war, that's what counts. Results." Over the following weeks, the story of Brennan's lone attack spread through the Allied forces in North Africa. It became one of those stories that men told each other in the mess tents, that got repeated and embellished until it took on a life of its own. Some details got exaggerated in the retelling. Some versions claimed he shot down 10 German fighters single-handedly. Others said he flew through the formation upside down, guns blazing. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment. One pilot, one aircraft, attacking a force 64 times his size, disrupting their formation and buying precious minutes for Allied bombers to complete their mission and escape. It was the kind of action that defined not just courage, but a willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than oneself. Brennan flew 43 more combat missions before the North African campaign ended in May 1943. He shot down 6 more enemy aircraft, damaged dozens of others, and somehow survived without serious injury. His P-40, patched and repaired after that morning over the desert, flew until the very end, finally being retired to a maintenance depot where it was cannibalized for spare parts. Major Caldwell was killed 2 months later, shot down over Tunisia while covering a ground attack mission. Brennan was there, saw it happen, watched helplessly as Caldwell's P-40 spiraled into the ground with no parachute appearing. It was the war. Men died. Friends died. You kept flying, kept fighting, because giving up meant dishonoring those who had fallen. Lieutenant Foster survived the war, returned to Iowa, and opened a flying school. He wrote to Brennan regularly, letters full of stories about crop dusters and student pilots who couldn't fly straight to save their lives. The letters always ended the same way. Come visit when you can. We'll go up together just like the old days. Without the Germans shooting at us, of course. Brennan himself continued flying after North Africa. He was transferred to the European theater, flew escort missions over France and Germany, watched Berlin burn from 30,000 feet as the Allied bombing campaign ground the Nazi war machine to dust. He was promoted to captain, then major, led his own squadron by the time the war ended in May 1945. When he finally returned home to Michigan in the summer of 1945, he was 26 years old and felt ancient. The small town where he had grown up seemed impossibly peaceful, impossibly normal. People went about their daily lives, worried about ordinary things, never realizing how close the world had come to darkness. Brennan did not talk much about the war. Most veterans did not. What could you say that would make sense to people who had not been there? But sometimes, on quiet evenings, sitting on his parents' porch and watching the sun set over the cornfields, Brennan would think about that morning over the North African desert. He would remember the fear, the clarity of purpose, the impossible odds. He would remember the sound of the P-40's engine, the smell of gunpowder and aviation fuel, the way the aircraft had shuddered under his hands as he pushed it to its limits. He never thought of himself as a hero. Heroes were for movies and books. He had just been a pilot doing his job, making the choice that needed to be made in that moment. But the men in those Hurricane bombers, the crews who had gone home to their families after the war, they remembered. Some of them tracked him down after the war, wrote letters thanking him, invited him to reunions. They called him the man who took on 64. In 1948, Brennan was invited to speak at a veterans organization dinner in Detroit. He had avoided such events, uncomfortable with the attention, but his mother convinced him to go. It was a formal affair, men in suits and their wives in evening dresses, everyone celebrating the victory and honoring those who had served. The organizer, a former bomber pilot named Colonel Richards, introduced Brennan to the crowd. He recounted the story of that morning in November 1942, when one P-40 pilot had attacked an entire Luftwaffe formation. The details were mostly accurate, which surprised Brennan. Usually these stories got wildly distorted. When Richards finished, the room erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, and Brennan felt his face flush with embarrassment. He had not done it for recognition. He had done it because it was necessary. But he stood and acknowledged the applause with a small wave, understanding that these people needed heroes, needed to believe that individuals could make a difference against impossible odds. After the dinner, a young man approached him, probably 19 or 20 years old, fresh-faced and earnest. He introduced himself as David Morrison, the son of Sergeant Morrison, the crew chief who had kept Brennan's P-40 flying throughout the North African campaign. "My father talks about you all the time," David said. "Says you were the finest pilot he ever worked with, not because you were the most skilled, though you were good, but because you cared about the mission, about the other guys. He told me about that day, when you came back with the plane shot to pieces. Said he could not believe anyone could fly that aircraft in that condition, let alone fight 64 enemy planes and survive." Brennan smiled, remembering the grizzled sergeant who had somehow kept that P-40 airworthy through months of combat. "How's your father doing?" "He passed away last year," David said quietly. "Cancer. But before he died, he made me promise to find you if I ever could, to thank you. Not just for that one day, but for all of it. He said you gave him purpose, gave all of them purpose. The ground crews, they did not get the glory, but they knew their work mattered because pilots like you depended on them." They sat and talked for an hour, Brennan sharing stories about Morrison Sr., the young man soaking up every detail about a father he was still trying to understand. When they finally parted, Brennan felt something shift inside him, a weight he had been carrying finally easing. The war had taken so much, but it had also created bonds that transcended time and death. Years passed. Brennan married, had children, built a life that looked normal on the surface. He worked as a commercial airline pilot, flying passengers across the country in Douglas DC-6s and later Boeing 707s. It was peaceful, routine, the polar opposite of combat flying. He liked it that way, but the memories never truly faded. Sometimes, late at night, he would wake from dreams where he was back in the P-40, the sky full of enemy fighters, his hands steady on the control stick as he dove into impossible odds. His wife learned not to wake him during these episodes, to just place a gentle hand on his shoulder and wait for him to come back to the present. In 1972, a historian writing a book about air combat in North Africa tracked Brennan down. The man, Dr. Harold Jenkins, was thorough and respectful, having interviewed dozens of veterans and cross-referenced their accounts with official records and even some captured German documents. He showed Brennan the Luftwaffe reports from that day in November 1942. The German accounts were revealing. The formation commander had written a detailed after-action report noting the surprise attack by what they initially believed was a squadron of American fighters. The report described the chaos as the formation broke up, the difficulty in coordinating a response against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. It was only after the engagement that they realized it had been a single aircraft. The German commander's report concluded with a notation that was both professional and oddly respectful. The American pilot displayed exceptional courage and tactical skill. His actions successfully disrupted our attack and allowed the enemy bomber formation to escape. Recommend increased vigilance for such aggressive tactics in future operations. Brennan read it twice, then handed it back to Jenkins. "I never thought about what they thought," he said. "In the moment they were just targets, threats to avoid and eliminate. But they were men too, doing their jobs, probably as scared as I was." Jenkins nodded. "That's what makes your story so compelling, Major Brennan. It's not just about aerial combat or impossible odds. It's about human beings pushed to their absolute limits, making choices that define who they are. You chose to attack when every rational calculation said you should retreat. That choice echoes across decades. The book, when it was published in 1974, became a minor bestseller. Jenkins had captured not just the tactical details of the engagement, but the human dimension, the fear and courage and split-second decision that had changed the course of that day. Brennan received letters from readers, some of them veterans who had their own stories of impossible choices, others simply grateful to read about a time when individuals could still change outcomes through will and action alone. One letter stood out, arriving in a foreign envelope with German stamps and careful handwriting. It was from a man named Klaus Fischer, a retired Luftwaffe pilot living in Munich, West Germany. Fischer wrote in careful, deliberate English, each word chosen with obvious thought, explaining that he had been one of the pilots in that formation on November 1942. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on good paper, the kind of letter that took time and effort to compose, that represented something more than casual correspondence. I have read Dr. Jenkins' book with great interest and some trepidation, Fisher wrote in his precise English. The account of the engagement on that November morning stirred memories I have spent many years trying to reconcile with the life I have built since the war. I believe, though I cannot be entirely certain after so many years, that you may have been the pilot who shot down my wingman, Oberleutnant Ernst Richter, on that day. Ernst was my closest friend. We had flown together since France in 1940, through the Battle of Britain where we both somehow survived, through the campaigns in the Balkans and Russia, and finally to North Africa. We had made a pact, Ernst and I, that whoever survived the war would visit the family of the one who did not, would tell them that their son or husband had died bravely, that he had not been forgotten. It is a common thing, I think, in war. Men make such pacts because it gives meaning to the possibility of death, makes it less random and senseless. When Ernst was hit and I saw his aircraft go down, I followed him as far as I dared, but I was engaged by another of your squadron's pilots and had to break off. I never saw whether he got out, whether he survived the crash. After the war, I visited his family in Hamburg. His mother was still alive, his father having died in the fighting in Russia. I told her what I knew, that Ernst had died in combat over North Africa, that he had been a brave pilot and a good friend. She thanked me, but I could see in her eyes that knowing did not make it easier. Her son was still dead, still taken from her by the war. For many years, I thought I would hate the pilot who killed Ernst for the rest of my life. It is easier, in some ways, to have someone to blame, some specific person to hold responsible for a loss that feels too large to be random chance. But over the years, as Germany rebuilt, and as I tried to understand what we had done, what we had been part of, I have come to understand that we were all trapped in something larger than ourselves, something terrible that consumed millions of lives for reasons that seem less clear with each passing year. Ernst died doing his duty, as did so many others on both sides. He was following orders, protecting our forces, fighting for his country as he understood it. He did not start the war. He did not make the decisions that led to the death camps and the invasions and the destruction of Europe. He was simply a young man who loved flying, who joined the Luftwaffe because it seemed like an honorable thing to do, and who found himself caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape except death or victory. Your courage that day, attacking when you were so outnumbered, that was the courage of a warrior. And warriors must respect each other even as enemies. I do not know what your thoughts were as you dove into our formation. I do not know whether you were afraid or whether training took over and fear was replaced by focus. But I know that it took immense bravery to do what you did, to make the choice you made when retreat would have been the sensible option. I wanted you to know that I bear you no ill will for Ernst's death. How can I, when my own hands shot down I do not know how many Allied pilots, when I killed men who had families and friends and lives they wanted to live? We were all killers in that war, all of us made instruments of destruction by forces we only dimly understood. The question is, what we do with that knowledge, how we live with the memories of what we did and what was done to us. I have spent the years since the war trying to build something positive, trying to atone in whatever small way I can for my part in that terrible time. I work with youth organizations now, trying to teach young Germans about the dangers of nationalism and blind obedience, trying to ensure that another generation does not make the mistakes we made. It is small work, perhaps insufficient given the magnitude of what happened, but it is what I can do. I hope you have found peace, as I have tried to find it. I hope the memories do not haunt you too badly and that you have been able to build a good life after the war. If you ever find yourself in Germany, I would be honored to meet you, to speak with you face to face about that day and about the years that have followed. Not to rehash old battles, but to acknowledge that we survived when so many did not, and to try to understand what that survival means, and what responsibilities it places upon us. With respect and regards, Klaus Fischer. Brennan sat in his study for a long time after reading that letter, staring at the photograph on his desk. It showed his P-40 squadron, all of them young and confident, standing in front of their aircraft in the North African sun. The photo had been taken in October 1942, just a month before the engagement with the German formation. So many of those faces were gone now, lost to war or to time. Foster was still alive, running his flying school in Iowa, sending letters full of stories about crop dusters and student pilots who could not fly straight. But Caldwell, Morrison, Phillips, Reeves, Wilson, Harrison, so many others, all of them dead. The war had taken them at 20, 25, 30 years old, frozen forever in their youth while the world moved on without them. He thought about Ernst Richter, the German pilot he had killed on that November morning. Had Richter seen Brennan diving on him? Had he had time to be afraid, or had it happened too fast? Had he felt pain, or had death been instantaneous? These were questions Brennan had asked himself about every man he had killed in combat. Questions that had no answers, but that demanded to be asked anyway. Each life taken, even in justified combat, even in defense of others, left a mark. You could rationalize it, explain it, justify it, but you could not erase it. Brennan wrote back to Fischer. It was not an easy letter to write. How do you communicate across such a gulf of experience and language and history? How do you bridge the gap between enemies who had spent years trying to kill each other? But he tried. He wrote about respect for courage, about the tragedy of men forced to kill each other over ideologies they did not fully understand, about the waste of young lives for causes that seemed less clear with each passing year. He wrote about Ernst Richter, expressing hope that the man had not suffered, that his death had been quick. He wrote about forgiveness and the possibility of peace, about the responsibility of survivors to remember, but also to move forward, to build something better than what had been destroyed. They continued to correspond over the years, these two old pilots who had once tried to kill each other. Their letters were infrequent but genuine, discussing families and grandchildren, the changing world, the hope that future generations would not have to face what they had faced. It was a small bridge across a terrible history, but it mattered. Brennan lived to see the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunion of Germany. He lived to see men walk on the moon, see computers shrink from room-sized machines to devices you could hold in your hand. The world changed in ways he could never have imagined as a young pilot, flying a P-40 over the desert. In his final years, living in a retirement community in Florida, Brennan sometimes gave talks to school groups about the war. He kept it simple, focused on the human aspects rather than the glory. He talked about fear and duty, about the men he had served with, about the importance of standing up when it mattered, even when the odds seemed impossible. A high school student once asked him if he had ever regretted his choice that day, if he would have done things differently, knowing what he knew now. Brennan thought about it carefully before answering. Regret is complicated, he said. Do I regret the men who died? Every single one, German, American, British, it does not matter. Every death was a tragedy, a life cut short. But do I regret the choice I made? No. Those hurricane crews needed time, and I was in a position to give it to them. If I had run, if I had played it safe, more men would have died. Sometimes in life you're presented with a choice that has no good options, only less bad ones. You do the best you can with the information and courage you have in that moment. That's all any of us can do. The student nodded, thoughtful, and Brennan hoped the lesson had landed. Not that he was some kind of superhero, but that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could find strength they did not know they possessed. James Brennan died in 2003 at the age of 84. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and a surprising number of veterans who had heard about his passing and wanted to pay respects. Foster was there, walking with a cane but still sharp, still with that same grin. Some of the hurricane crews he had saved, now in their 80s themselves, made the journey to Florida to honor the man who had given them a future. At the service, Foster stood and told the story one more time, the story of a 23-year-old pilot who had looked at impossible odds and decided that someone had to stand, someone had to fight, someone had to buy time for others to live. It was a story about courage, but also about sacrifice and the recognition that individual actions could ripple across time, changing lives in ways that could never be fully measured. When 64 enemy planes surrounded his P-40 that morning over the North African desert, James Brennan made a choice in seconds that no one ever forgot. He chose to attack. He chose to fight. He chose to give others a chance at survival, even if it meant his own death. That choice defined him. Not because it made him a hero in the traditional sense, but because it showed what humans were capable of when they refused to surrender to fear or overwhelming odds. The sky over Florida was clear and blue on the day of his funeral, much like that morning in 1942. As the honor guard fired their salute and a lone bugler played taps, those who had known him looked up at that sky and remembered. They remembered a young pilot in a battered P-40, guns blazing, diving alone into a formation that should have killed him. They remembered courage that transcended tactics and skill, courage born from the simple recognition that some things were worth dying for. The war had been over for nearly 60 years, but the lesson remained. In the face of impossible odds, one person making the right choice could change everything. James Brennan had proven that on a clear morning over the desert, and the world was better for it. His life, his choice, his courage, these things echoed across the decades, a reminder that heroism was not about seeking glory, but about doing what was necessary when no one else could or would. In the end, that was his legacy. Not medals or recognition, though he received both, not fame or fortune. But the knowledge that when it mattered most, he had stood, he had fought. He had given others the chance to live. And in a world often defined by darkness and despair, that light of individual courage remained, a beacon for future generations facing their own impossible choices.